Welcome to this session of the Welsh Affairs Committee, where we're continuing our short inquiry into prisons in Wales. And for this afternoon's session, we're joined by the Right Honourable Edward Argar MP, who is the Minister for Prisons, Parole and Probation, the Ministry of Justice. Welcome, Minister. And we're grateful also to Mr Ian Barrow, who is Executive Director for HMPPS Wales, and is alongside you to help with the evidence this afternoon. Before we begin properly, I'd like to make a statement with regards to the recent deaths at HMP Park and the House's sub judice resolution. A coroner's inquest has been opened into some of the deaths of men at HMP Park, and those proceedings are now sub judice. In the same way as the Speaker did on Monday in the Chamber, and with his permission this afternoon, I'm waiving the sub judice resolution for today's evidence session, given the interest and importance of the issues. Members are not intending to inquire into the specific circumstances of any individual's death. I'm sure all members and witnesses will exercise caution in their questions and answers, given the possibility of future criminal or civil proceedings in relation to those deaths. So, with that out the way, perhaps I can start the discussion, Minister, just by asking you and Mr Barrow, just very briefly, and we do need to be concise in our questions and answers this afternoon because we've got a lot of ground to cover, but if you could just briefly outline your sense of how well the prison estate in Wales is performing, specifically on the issues of safety of inmates and staff.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting us here before your committee today. Just jot those down. Safety and assaults were the key elements you wanted.
Safety of inmates and staff working inside the prison.
Yeah. So overall, in terms of the prison estate, which, as you'll be aware, is 6 prisons over 5 sites, at the moment, in terms of inspection results, all of the prisons, when last inspected, were either at a 3 or a 4, which is either reasonably good or good in respect of the safety, one of the 4 indicators. So there is, as compared to the overall prison estate, the Welsh prison estate performs well. However, in terms of the number of prisoner-on-prisoner assaults, which is one good indicator of where we are with things. Although from a very high level in 2016, 2017, the number of assaults have come down, for example, at Park, they have gone up after the past 2 or 3 years following the end of the COVID restrictions and the return of a normal regime. So if it's helpful, I can give the committee just some example statistics so they can compare, and I'm happy if it's helpful to the committee subsequently to share the table rather than running through multiple numbers of stats. But you take, for example, Park, 2017, 688 prisoner-on-prisoner assaults, dropping down to 262 last year, back up to over 400 this year. So still not at those high levels, but higher than it has been. Similarly, in terms of prisoner-on-staff assaults, again, because I suspect we may cover it in more detail, if you take Park as an example, again, 2017, a high figure, 260, dropped down to below 100 in 2022, 2023, back up to almost 200. So I would say, if I may, every one of those assaults is one too many. We want to drive down the numbers of assaults, and I pay tribute to the staff in the prison. But what we've seen is a trend, or a downward trend, in violence and assaults, but a concerning, I'll be honest with the committee, concerning uptick in the 2023 figures.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful. If we could move on specifically to HMP Park then. Do you think members of the community in the Bridgend area, family members of inmates at Park, are right to be alarmed at recent reports of deaths at Park?
So if I can put on the record at the beginning as well, my condolences and sympathies to the family and friends of all those who've lost their lives. I think there is a challenge both for the prison and for the community in terms of the deaths we've seen in both the community and in the prison as a result of substance misuse and drugs in recent months. In terms of those 9 deaths in Park, without and heeding, conscious of your admonition at the beginning, without going to individual cases, what I can do is talk about the numbers, 4 of which we are fairly confident are substance misuse related. 1, potentially so, but we're awaiting toxicology and police investigations into that. The other 4 are not substance misuse related, so I think it's important we just set that context. But there is, as I set out in addressing the House, I think a couple of days ago when there was an urgent question on this, there is a shared challenge for both the community and the prison, and what's going to be essential going forward and is in place, but I think there's more we can do on that, is close working between the prison authorities, the police, Bridgend Council, Public Health Wales and the local health board as well, because a lot of the solutions to this are also rooted in devolved areas of policy. So it is a shared problem, and it's going to require joint working to solve that challenge.
Okay, I'm going to start bringing in colleagues now. So Beth Winter, perhaps you could go first.
Yeah, and thank you for your time today.
Minister.
Well, there have been 9 deaths of prisoners in just 10 weeks at HMP Park. Is it a safe prison?
On the basis of the assessment by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, yes, we consider it a safe prison, but that doesn't mean to say that there isn't clearly a concern about this. As I say, we've seen deaths in the community as well related to substance misuse. There is a shared challenge there, particularly at the moment, and that's why, although overall the prison has got, in 2022, when last inspected, very good inspection ratings, that is why we have issued an improvement notice specifically around the security in this particular issue to focus attention on that.
So in Justice Questions yesterday, I don't know if you heard, but in response to the questions I raised, the Minister referred to the inspection report, which you have just mentioned yourself, which was in 2002, which he quoted was measured HMP Park as good and 3 measures of reasonably good. However, and I've got the report here, it also recorded self-harm remained too high, overall rates of violence were too high, expressed concern at mental health and learning disability services, and expressed concern at the shortage of staff and offender management and resettlement roles. And around that time, G4S was awarded a 10-year contract to run the prison. It was in the same year. And the data shows there's been an increase in violence since that inspection, included in 2023, according to the Ministry of Justice, the highest ever recorded number of assaults, up by around 20% on previous years, and assaults on staff in 2023 were up 40 to 45%. So, how satisfied are you with HMP Park's response to the recent deaths? And can I also ask what metrics are being currently used? Because that inspection report is almost 2 years old now. So I've got serious concerns about referring to a prison as good based on metrics from two years ago, given the number of deaths that have happened.
So there's a number of questions there. Firstly, as I made clear, we don't want to see any deaths in our custody. Sadly, we will on occasions from natural causes, of which I have to say some of these deaths were from natural causes and in the nature of the population at Park and at other prisons, given underlying health conditions or old age. That does sometimes happen, so we cannot completely eliminate deaths in our custody from natural causes. But what does give cause for concern, as I made very clear, are those which are from factors that should be to a much greater degree within our control, be it from substance misuse or be it from self-inflicted deaths. In terms of the specific points you picked out from that report in 2022 and the concerns, I've already spoken about the assaults, and we can talk about some of what's being done in the prison subsequently, depending on the questions you or the Chair wish to ask. But in terms of people with learning disabilities and neurodiversity, actually, I was in Park last month, and their neurodiverse wing is actually one of the most impressive in the prison system, with the training in place, with the support in place. What is important to remember, though, is that broader mental health provision and support is, of course, the responsibility of the Welsh Government and the health boards in Wales, so that's devolved. So partnership working is important, but it's also recognising that the responsibility for that is also sitting with the health boards and with the Welsh Government in that respect. The other point that you raised was about staff, and your concerns about staffing numbers. I may be out, but only by literally a few, as in single figures. My understanding is that in terms of vacancies at the moment among prison officers and so on, it's around a dozen, and that's it, that staffing has increased significantly. So you're right to highlight that in the report at that time that was flagged, but action has been taken and G4S have recruited more staff.
Do you accept that the Chief Inspectors of Prisons report actually 2 years ago now raised some serious concerns? I mentioned rates of violence, self-harm, mental health services at that point in time. So that's 2 years ago. And now we've experienced, nine deaths just in the last 10 weeks. So what has been done between that inspection report and now to address those serious...
There's a number of points. I think it's important that I again come back to the fact that quite rightly you referenced 9 deaths, but the 2 of those were natural causes deaths, we believe. So that's important. The second point is, and that's not diminishing them in any way, but I just think it's important to understand the context. The second point, again, is to highlight that in terms of deaths where it's believed drugs were involved, we are seeing a similar number of deaths in the community as well, a similar number of deaths related to drugs in the broader community.
In South Wales?
Yeah. So I think we've got to be a little bit careful about this, and I don't want to, ever aware of what the Chair has said, draw any hard and fast conclusions before the Ombudsman's reported, before the coroner's inquests have reported, but I understand there has been a broader problem, particularly with netazenes as a drug in the broader area. Now, that's not in any way to diminish talking about what is within our power, which is within the prison. In terms of mental health, yes, there was a challenge then. I think there is still a challenge, and there's more to do by the Health Board, but there's more to do with us in working with them. In terms of one of the single biggest factors that can improve safety in the prison, G4S have increased the number of staff. We've seen those vacancies being filled. There are still a few to go, but we've seen that. That makes a big difference in a prison. Equally, in terms of safety more broadly and security, the link with drugs, the link also with weapons or contraband that could cause this. The prison's put in place a new strategy in the case of drugs about restricting supply, promoting recovery and reducing demand. We've got a bid for enhanced gate security that's currently going through HMPPS to enable them, if I recall, to have a second scanner at the entrance. We've got the RappiScan, which is a scanner that detects drugs, but we've also got handheld detectors now, which make it a lot easier to go cell to cell to this. So there's a lot of work already being done. Staffing, though, I think is a key element. Is that me saying the job is done? It most certainly isn't. But I think we've got a clear direction of travel from G4S in what they're seeking to do to tackle this. But the most important thing is to come back to that point that I think this is a shared challenge, and we've got to work together with our partners in the devolved administration and those devolved areas, as well as in G4S and as well as in HMPPS.
I've got a couple of points.
Very briefly then, Beth, please.
In terms of the staffing issue, we've all heard from constituents and staff who work in the prison of a crisis that's taken place in terms of staff, lack of experience, management. So I'd be interested to follow that up with you. But who are you saying is accountable? Who would you hold accountable for the situation in Park? Because you awarded a contract to G4S around the same time as this inspection report, which did raise serious concerns. Are you going to consider reviewing the decision to award the contract, or to take the prison back as you've done elsewhere, such as in Birmingham? Because operationally, there are issues, there are actions that can be taken, but there are clearly systemic issues here, and G4S has a track record as a private provider of failings in the provision of...
So there's a number of questions there. I'll take one very briefly. You are right to highlight that although the numbers of staff are improved, experience always remains a challenge, and it does more broadly across the prison service. We're recruiting a lot more people in. That is a good thing, but of course those new officers with great potential don't have the experience of others. So I think that's a fair point to highlight. In terms of talking about the prison more broadly, I'll answer your question directly. No, we have no intentional plan to take the contract back. We consider that Park is, recognising the challenges here, a well-run prison and an effective prison. There are challenges in this specific case around security and around these issues, which is why a notice has been issued about further urgent action, focused support to address on that. But overall, we consider that Park is a well-run prison. But to your point, hypothetically, that not to be the case, what would be the approach? The prison is accountable to the inspector in the same way as any other prison. It also has a Ministry of Justice HMPPS controller in there who will work to Ian, in that context, who manages the contract, manages their performance against it. And if, and I'm not saying there is in this case, but if there were grounds, and we have seen it recently with another prison elsewhere in the country, where there were grounds where it goes through various layers and it gets to a point where we think there is a challenge, then there is an option, as we've done there, to put in a public sector governor or to go further. But we don't think that that is appropriate in this case.
Would you welcome another inspection? Because it's 2 years since the last one.
I think it may have even been an answer to you in the chamber. I made the point that is entirely up to the chief inspector.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Beth. Tonya.
Do you think the problem, Minister, may be around equivalence of pay between those that are employed at G4S and those that are employed, say, in other prisons, maybe like Swansea and Cardiff? That there's a difference in pay, and that's why you don't get the experience, because there's different scales. Does that not attract the right people, and does it basically, if there's no equivalence, make people want to go somewhere else?
Well, I think that you quite rightly pick up on a key point. What we've done in recent years, which is a good thing, is significantly increased the pay to frontline public sector prison officers. Right thing to do, good thing, and we're seeing the benefits from retention and recruitment. I think what you're getting at, which is a fair point, is if that then moves things out of kilter with pay rates in other institutions, do you start either, when you're fishing in a broader public pool, someone who wants to do that job says, well, I'll go there, because the pay is higher, or even potentially attract people from the private sector prison who goes across saying, well, I'm doing the same job, but I can do it there. I think that, if I'm being honest, I think that has been a challenge historically. I think we are now getting to a point where looking at those staffing levels, and when I spoke to the director there, she was saying she was able to recruit, she was able to retain. So I think that we're seeing that balance out again now. But I think historically, and by which I mean recently historically, I think you're right to highlight that there was a challenge there when we quite dramatically increased prison officer pay in recent years, and people did shift. So I think that's a fair challenge.
Well, I mean, we were having this conversation earlier, but, you know, if I was a prison officer and it was my integrity and my job that was being questioned, at the moment, I'd want to, prove to the public and to my employer that I am a trustworthy person. But prison officers are not currently searched by the X-ray body scanners, and HMPPS doesn't have the legal permission to do so. You've talked about the rapid scan and the new handheld equipment. Will you be seeking to change the law in order to allow prison staff entering a prison to be searched using these body scanners?
I take the point, and I think it was a point made in parallel by the chair in the chamber of the House recently. We have no current plans to routinely scan or take the powers to scan prison officers. They are subject to, and I might bring in just a second Ian, just in case he wants to correct anything I've said thus far, which may have got wrong. But we do conduct random searches, things like bags and similar. But equally, when you've got prison officers who you've put through vetting, who you've employed, who are in positions of trust, there is an element of you recognise that and you respect that, but you do random checks occasionally. So I don't think it would be practical or appropriate to insist everyone coming to and from work gets scanned each day, and so we don't have plans to do that. But equally, what I would say is where there is intelligence about someone, an officer, a member of staff who is bringing contraband in or breaking the rules, breaking the law, then that will be handled appropriately by the police and others. I have to say it is thankfully rare. The vast majority of prison service staff are dedicated professionals who go to work wanting to do the right thing. But it does happen, and therefore it's right when it does that the police and others investigate fully. But I don't know if there's anything I need to have corrected already by Ian in this.
Nothing to correct. I just reiterate, I think that prison staff are subject to searches. I mean, the X-ray searches obviously look for items that have been secreted internally. We get very little information that is a route for prison officers to bring information to bring issues into custody. Also use of sniffer dogs, bags, random searches, intelligence searches. So there are a range of things that sort of, in addition to sort of potential X-ray searches. And the only other point I was going to make, perhaps just going back to your last question, was, so obviously I can't speak on behalf of G4S. I am aware that G4S have looked at their pay and reward remuneration over the last 12 months. It's probably worth saying that we do see movement of staff between G4S and public sector prison and vice versa. It is something that is, I don't think it's as straightforward as just G4S staff are not necessarily paid as well as public sector.
Oh, no, yeah, I get that. But also, Ian, probably you can answer this. What support is available to prison staff that may be at risk from being blackmailed, bribed or otherwise coerced? And does that support vary then between private and public sector?
No, I think it's quite similar. I think there are a range of sort of anti-corruption measures in place. We've also got anti-corruption teams. Part of that are confidential helplines for staff to contact. There are sort of specific inputs when people qualify as prison officers or when they start jobs as prison officers to look at anti-corruption measures, what they may be subject to and what to look out for in those sort of situations. I think it's something that it's very well focused on in the prison service. It's a sort of a live conversation. So I think that managers will look out and have specific conversations with staff if there's any sort of indication of vulnerability or any suggestion that staff may be subject to coercion.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Minister, I think you said that instances of staff bringing drugs into prisons was, I think you said, rare.
In the context of our overall staff workforce, the point I was making is that the overwhelming majority of our staff, we believe, are honest, dedicated public servants. So it was in that context, if I may, Chair.
And I would concur with that, and the visits that I've done as a member of this committee and previously as a minister to prisons in Wales, I've always been struck by the professionalism of the staff we've met, and some of us were in Cardiff prison recently, and not only were we impressed by what we saw of the staff, but sitting down with prisoners at the end of the visit, the prisoners themselves told us how much respect they felt they had from staff, and that was kind of a very healthy and positive thing. But all of that can be true, and there still be a problem of drugs coming into prisons where maybe staff are involved. And on Monday in the Chamber I read out a piece of written evidence that had been sent to this committee by a prisoner serving in HMP Park who said, and I'm going to slightly paraphrase, but essentially that drugs are everywhere, and he listed types of drugs that are in circulation, he's claimed, within Park, and he said that some, I think he used the phrase dribs and drabs, may come in through other means, but he said, let's be clear, the vast majority are coming in through staff. Now, when I read out that statement, Mr. Barrow, would your reaction to that be, well, that just isn't true? That claim by that prisoner is incorrect? Or is there a ring of truth to it?
So I don't think we've got a concern that the vast majority would necessarily been brought in by staff. I think, as I just reiterate what I just said, anybody entering the prison, including staff, may be searched on entry. There's routine searching staff, there's intelligence-led searching staff.
Sorry, Mr. Barrow. I've been told by the technical staff you need to speak up a little bit just so that we can get the recording.
Sorry, I've got a very low voice. Yeah. What I was saying was that everybody who enters a prison, including staff, can be subject to searching. In 3 of the prisons in Wales, so in Berwyn, in Cardiff and Swansea, we've already got enhanced gate security. So that are dedicated search teams, specially trained members of staff who will search either visitors or staff when they enter the prisons. We obviously take appropriate action if staff are found to be sort of involved in any sort of conveyance or suspicion. And even though we don't, as we said, have the legal authority in terms of using X-ray machines, if there's any suspicion that staff are conveying any items, illicit items into prison, they can be excluded from the prison whilst investigations are undertaken.
Are there any staff at Park currently under investigation for trafficking of drugs?
I don't think it would be, if I may, Chair, appropriate to answer that in this context. I will, if I may, take advice subsequently and write to the committee in terms such as I am able to, that would then be on the record, but I just want to be a little bit cautious because I am conscious there may well be things going on that even I don't know about because they will be operational, so I don't want to risk misleading the committee or saying something that would be either inaccurate or cause operational problems. But with your permission, I'll seek advice and write to you subsequently, Chair.
Okay, and can I ask them the question you may choose to answer in similar terms, but I'll ask it anyway, whether you have data to hand with respect to numbers of staff dismissed from prisons in Wales as a result of investigations into bringing in of drugs or other contraband?
I don't, Mr. Barrow may, but if not, I can add that to my response to your committee, sir.
So we have got some numbers. I mean, that information is not published, and some of it is not published because the numbers are so low that they could potentially identify people, but we will sort of, as the Minister said, give voice on that.
Can I also just add, Chair, very briefly, in terms of reassurance about how seriously it is taken when there are genuine allegations, as part of our security investment programme, we've recruited over 140 new staff to the counter-corruption unit, which do a number of things. One, they investigate. We've also got 20 police investigators dedicated to investigating corruption within HMPPS and bring their expertise to bear on that. But those staff, those 140 and their colleagues, also work as well as investigating in training staff in how to spot the risk, because there's always a risk. An inexperienced officer does something they think is minor, and then suddenly they're entrapped, and suddenly you've got a challenge, and they get more and more caught up in it. When you were a Secretary of State, I suspect you probably saw cases in different contexts where someone did something silly, but not much more, but in seeking to avoid having to explain that or get out of that, they got more and more drawn in. I'm not saying that happens often, but again, those officers, those staff are there to also help give advice and help people avoid getting caught in that way.
Okay, thank you very much. Ben Lake, please.
Just in terms of the evidence we've received as a committee from serving prisoners and former staff members from Park, much has been said about the intelligence-based and risk-based approach to searches. Has there been a change in the regime of searching staff and other visitors to Park in light of some of these concerns?
Yes, so I mean there's been a range of sort of actions taken in relation to Park, including searches within the prison.
Right.
For things that we're also sort of ensuring that intelligence-led, as you say, searches are prevalent at Park when visitors are attending at the moment.
And that's increased in light of recent sort of...
So.
And with very active cooperation, I should put on the record our gratitude to South Wales Police actually for their engagement with us, particularly around this, but more broadly.
Beth, very briefly then.
Sorry, just going back to staffing. In the Inspector's report, there was an expression of concern the shortage of staff in offender management and resettlement roles. Now, you've alluded to the fact that that has changed and improved, but I'd be interested to see the data on that. However, we've all received evidence, and today I've received further evidence from staff and inmates who have expressed serious concerns about insufficient staff, lack of experienced staff, management cutting corners to try and save money, staff not feeling they've got competence or the resources to be able to recognise these comments that are being made.
Well, I think there's one point I would pick out there, which I think is, as I've alluded to, is a challenge that's being worked on, but it's a challenge, which is the point that Ms. Antoniazzi made, which is about it's not just about the numbers, it's about the experience. And there's a large number there who are, I think, able, they're keen, they're good officers, but they're new officers. And therefore it's important, which I believe is happening, that more experienced officers and the G4S management team there work directly with them to give them that support, because we can all, in any job we do, you can learn so much from your training manuals, but actually, even in this place, we learn a lot more from our colleagues and from actually seeing it done and doing the job. So there is more support going in to help do that. But that's the point you raised in that list that I would recognise.
It's really important, and I will finish on this, sorry, Chair. In terms of the action the G4S is taking to address what I feel are systemic issues, it's easy to look at the symptoms, but there are systemic problems there when you've got 9 deaths. Are they reporting directly to you? Is there an action plan looking at staff training as well as rehousing of offenders? The action plan from this inspection report was very detailed. Are they reporting directly so you know that those actions have been taken?
They report up through their controller to Mr. Barrow. And
is that action plan in place?
Who will then escalate to me as appropriate via the leadership of HMPPS.
They do. So there are a number of sort of fronts on this. So directly from the inspection, G4S completed an action plan. G4S completed an action plan that is submitted to the Inspectorate, and the controller and the team will work to looking at that. Whenever there's a death in custody, the Prison and Probation Ombudsman will also undertake investigation. Yeah. And if a need for an action plan will be drawn up in relation to that, again, that's reported back to the Ombudsman, obviously, and also by ourselves. And as part of the improvement notice that we have issued G4S recent we're currently working with them to put together an action plan in relation to the specific issues.
Okay, sorry, Chair.
No, thank you very much. We're going to broaden the issues somewhat, if I may. Can I ask about the prison population? And I think the government's projected a prison population of 96,200 by March 2025. How ready is the Welsh prison estate to play its role in housing such a number of prisoners?
Well, as you'll be aware, even at this moment in time, we see significant capacity challenges within the custodial estate, the closed custodial estate, I should make that distinction. It is interesting that at the moment, with Welsh prisons operating at a very high level, Park is pretty much near its operational capacity. It may be a few dozen below given day, but it's operating that. And other prisons such as Cardiff and Swansea. I have to say that overall, the prisons in Wales are managing that increased pressure, in my opinion, well. We're seeing, you will possibly see when you're in Cardiff, it's a well-run prison. They're working hard, they're managing that. But it is undoubtedly the case that when you have less headroom, it is harder because you can't create space, you can't move people around in the same way. And I suspect that, and we may come on to it, where that may create a pressure is people being placed further away from family. We may talk as well about female offenders and the challenges that already exist given the nature of the estate in Wales. So it does create further challenges. At the moment, and I'll be frank with the committee, I have no plans to increase the custodial estate in Wales in terms of the closed estate or build more prisons. So it will continue to play a key part in our custodial system, but actually our plans for building are rooted in the 6 new prisons, 2 of which completed, 1 being built, 2 just through planning, and 1 at the moment being considered in a planning appeal in England. I don't have plans at this moment in time to build new closed prisons in Wales.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the government's ambition to have 20,000 new prison places, we're some way off that. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I think in terms of where we are now, it was around that by the mid-2020s, and I know that some will fixate on the 2025, but plural mid-2020s. But where, being frank with this committee, I think we are is at the moment just shy of 6,000 new places or additional places in place. I think, and this is where I will be corrected by Mr. Barrow, I think we're aiming for around, or we're expecting around 10,000 a couple of years after, to have hit the 10,000 mark a couple of years after that. One of the challenges, which I will be completely frank about, is that 3 of those prisons at least, the big new prisons, took a lot longer in planning than I suspect was envisaged when the timeline was first set. We've got 5 of them through planning now. There's 1 still going through it, so I'll be a little cautious about what I say about that one.
Understood. And therefore, can I ask you about how the Welsh prison estate is being affected by Operation Early Dawn?
Well, in fact, Operation Early Dawn is more focused around operations with magistrates' courts, cells, holding cells, who can be moved and movements of people. Where there is on occasion a challenge is if you have prisoner movements via the prisoner escort and custodial service, sometimes at hours that they would not normally, so earlier in the morning or sometimes into the evenings and beyond, because that's when a cell is freed up, so you then get someone back. So that will increase the pressure. I think the real pressure, if I'm being honest, on the prison estate in Wales will come from the overall capacity challenges, because it limits that headroom for governors and others to move people around to other prisons or to create space to do maintenance work. We'll always make sure essential life-preserving maintenance work like fireworks will continue to be done according to the timetable we've set. But those additional maintenance works that are beneficial but not essential to protecting life may sometimes be harder to do because you just can't create an empty wing to do them. So there is a challenge there. And of course it adds pressure on staff.
Oh. Will prisoners in Wales be released early under current measures?
To the best of my knowledge, the ECSL measures apply to England and Wales. It's the single justice system.
And are you confident that public safety is being looked after? And those instances?
The point I would make about that is this, compared to the scheme that ran between 2007 and 2010, this is a scheme with a considerable number of exemptions and carve-outs of who is not able to be released under this scheme. Also, and I can run through them actually, which is prisoners, or examples, prisoners serving an imprisonment, for example, of over 4 years, a sentence of over 4 years for a violent offence, prisoners serving a sentence for a terrorist offence, prisoner serving a sentence for any sexual offence or subject to Sexual Offences Act 2003 sex offenders register notification. There are many other exemptions. The other key exemption that exists as a safeguard is that if there is any doubt or there is a concern about that release, the governor has what colloquially is known as the governor lock. They can block that release because they will know that prisoner, and if they have those concerns, they can stop that release on safety grounds. So there are safeguards built into this in a way that were not previously there under previous schemes.
Okay. Very brief.
The only point I was going to add to that, was just also worth noting that when people are released under the end of custody supervised licence, they are still subject to the licence conditions they would have been at the end.
On that point, because I've been contacted by prison staff regarding the early release scheme who are extremely concerned that on the 23rd of May, and I'm quoting now, it comes into force, which is just before a bank holiday, and as well as looking at public protection, for the vast majority of prisoners who are rehabilitated, there's clearly a shortage of move-on housing support, which has come out in the survey that we've done. What's your response to the staff who are very, very concerned about the implications of releasing prisoners early?
So it's worth reiterating, I think, that the end of custody supervised licence scheme is already in operation. What's happening at the end of May is it's extended to 70 days prior to this. Housing is clearly an issue. Wales is doing well in terms of Welsh prisoners. The percentage of prisoners who are released from custody in Wales who are accommodated on release is actually higher than England and Wales together. We are working very closely with Welsh Government. We work with local authorities. We've identified specific accommodation pathway coordinators that are employed in probation delivery units to look at smoothing the path as far as you can in terms of accommodation. It's fair to say that it is a difficult area, without a doubt. There are...
Share these concerns about the early release scheme?
I don't think that necessarily has a significant impact on the issues about housing and homelessness. I think that what it means is that it's bringing forward work that would need to be done anyway. So work is done within the offender management units in custody, within probation delivery units, etc. will have been focused on accommodation, will have been focused on looking what to do in terms of sentence planning, the release planning for people coming out.
There's added pressure on staff, already and under-resourced and overstretched staff.
It's bringing work forward.
Sorry, sir.
And the only point I'd make very briefly, if I may, Chair, is, and I would recognise that actually the relationships between our prisons in Wales and the Welsh authorities providing housing are pretty good, actually. And I know that there is a pressure, which I think I read in one of your transcripts, that there's something like 11,000 people who are in temporary accommodation, but the challenge is getting people into permanent. But getting people into temporary accommodation, actually, on the ground and operationally, it's a devolved matter, but Ian and his team, I think, have good relationships with those devolved services.
Okay, thank you very much. With the pressures on the prison population, do you envisage an increase in the number of prisoners sharing cells in Wales, Mr. Barrow?
At the moment, we are, as the Minister said, we are slightly under our operational capacity. If we look at increase any cell sharing, that would be a decision that would be undertaken by the Prison Group Director, who's somebody that sort of works as part of my team, and that will only be done looking at safety and decency considerations in terms of both the size of the cells, ventilation, lighting, sanitation, etc. At the moment, we're not in a position where we are considering looking to increase cell sharing. But as I said, if that does happen, it is a decision, it's an operational decision that's taken by the Prison Group Director.
Does prison cell sharing, how significant a factor is that in violence within prisons? Is it correlated?
Not particularly, I don't think. I think actually it can actually be a protective factor. I mean, sometimes having somebody sharing a cell with somebody who understands how the prison's working, has got experience of it, can also, certainly in terms of self-harm, it can be seen as a protective factor quite a lot.
Okay, thank you. Tonya, please.
Yes. Could I go to talking about the female estate, Chair, if that's okay?
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
The committee has heard evidence regarding the disproportionate way in which short custodial sentences impact on the lives of female offenders. Now, given that there's already a move towards expanding community sentence options for female offenders, why did the department not pilot this policy of suspending short sentences, as included within the Sentencing Bill in 2023, on a female prison population first?
Well, I think it is undoubtedly the case that, subject to the will of Parliament and the passage of that legislation, that measure actually, although it will benefit adult males and adult females, when you look at the proportion of those in custody in the female estate and the nature of their sentences, it would in a sense disproportionately benefit them, because often women are still being given short sentences. I wrote the female offender strategy back in, I think it was 2018, 2019, and the direction of travel we wanted to see there, and then working with the Women's Justice Blueprint for Wales, was to see fewer women being sentenced to short custodial terms. There will always be some for whom a custodial term will be necessary given the severity of the offence or other factors. And I think we are seeing progress in fewer women being sentenced to shorter custodial terms. But if I can be frank with the committee, I think the number is still too high. I'd like to see more progress. And often what you see is a lot of those women have not committed offences which are dangerous to others or to the community, and a lot of those women are, if I can put it this way, as well as perpetrators, are often also victims of trauma, of assault, of crime themselves. So I think the direction of travel, which we may come on to shortly, is that the residential women's centre model is one which I advocated back then. It's nice to see 5 years later it's sort of making progress. I think that offers a potential blueprint for a way forward, and I know that it's something that when I back then and now speak to the Welsh Government, they are very clear with me. They do not wish to see a closed women's prison in Wales, even acknowledging the challenges that brings when someone does have to be sentenced to the closed estate, not being able to be accommodated as close to home as necessary. And I think that the direction of travel there, fewer short sentences, I should clarify, it's a matter for judges, and it's a matter for this House whether it passes that legislation. But the direction of travel is one that I would advocate.
And as you've alluded to, the Residential Women's Centre in Swansea was announced in May 2022. I remember being on the call, and it would open its doors in 2024. This prison, Chair, Residential Women's Centre will, at the next general election, become into the constituency of Gower. So I am aware that there have been issues locally on a planning level, and I believe that they've been overcome. But could you give me an update on the progress that has been made and when the doors are expected to open?
So I fear, Ms Antoniazzi, I can't give you a date for that, but I can give possibly a little more information about it. It'll be, as you'll be aware, a 12-bed centre housing around 50 local offenders a year, providing community-based service that helps to give an alternative to short custodial sentences. You're absolutely right to highlight there were planning issues which caused a period of uncertainty in securing planning permissions and the appropriate approvals. We've got a number of steps to go through now to remobilise that project, to get it moving forward again following the progress that has been made. So it'll be a few months before I can give specific timeframes, or you'll see sort of spades in the ground or similar. But what I can say is I'll work closely with the Welsh Government, and I've already had a conversation with Leslie Griffith an initial conversation, and she's very kindly invited me to visit her in Cardiff, which I will seek to do. We'll work closely with her, with other local partners, and of course with local members of Parliament to try to move that forward. I'm keen to see it moving forward, and I will, if it's a matter of months and I can give a bit more clarity, I'll of course write to the Honourable Lady and the committee more broadly so that members can see it.
And just, for the record and for Ian, I am aware that there have been a bit of a relationship breakdown between the local community and the Ministry of Justice, which is disappointing, and I will, if we can have this conversation outside of this room at another time, I think there's a lot of work that I could do and help with on that.
Well, can I make an offer, Ms Antoniazzi, that I'm always happy to speak to you, but equally I'm happy to volunteer Mr Barrow to have an official level conversation with you about some of the details that we may not be able to go into in this session for a variety of reasons, not least time, but I'm happy for that engagement to take place.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. What estimates have been made of the number of people who would have otherwise received a sentence that won't receive a custodial sentence if the legislation goes through that suspends short custodial sentences? What kind of numbers are we talking about?
The short answer, if I'm being honest, is it's very difficult to tell because it's a presumption, but judges will still be able to disregard that if they so wish. So it does come down to judicial behaviour. If a judge can say, actually, I see the presumption, it's a strong presumption, but I'm not doing that because... So it's been very hard. So when we were looking at when my colleagues doing the sentencing bill were looking at this, it's been very difficult in terms of an impact analysis to actually quantify with any sense of a hard number, because it does come down to a large degree to judicial behaviour. If judicial behaviour sees that presumption being acted on, I think it is a fair assumption to say you'd see a greater benefit, if I can put it that way, among the female offender population than you would in the adult males, proportionately, but it is extremely difficult to try and give an exact number, which I appreciate will, I suspect, as and when the sentencing bill reappears, it may be a slight frustration to colleagues in the House, but we will do our best to add some more flesh to the bones on that.
As a Minister, what do you think is the point of short sentences? Do they serve a useful purpose?
Well, I mean, my personal view is that got wrong, so there will always need to be, I think, the facility for short sentences, because there will be occasions where someone is just refusing to engage with the alternatives, is a prolific or persistent offender, and a magistrate or a judge is eventually going to say, I have no choice. This is the X number of times you've been in my court before me, I'm going to have to do this. There may be particular factors specific to the case. My concern particularly, though, and why I put it in the female offender strategy, my concern around them in the context of female offenders was they were often, and I think Eastwood Park is something like a month or a little over that is the average sentence. And I went to Eastwood Park, I spoke to the governor, and it summed it up for me saying it is too short a time for us to have them in our custody and actually begin to be making real inroads into tackling the underlying causes of the offending, the underlying trauma, the underlying offences committed against them, mental health issues or a whole range of others. It doesn't give them enough time to actually meaningfully build a relationship with that woman and start helping them. But it's a long enough time to potentially lose, in often chaotic lifestyles, the remaining bits of stability, be it the flat, be it the kids, be it the job that may not pay a huge amount but is something and it's a bit of a framework. That's the challenge with them. And we also see, in truth, that reoffending rates are better for tough community sentences than they are for a very short custodial sentence. I say that particularly in the context of female offenders because that was the route we came down this, but more broadly that is true. So that is where I approach it from. I don't want to take away that option for sentences completely, because there will be occasions when it's needed, prolifics and others, but equally what I want to see from it is, yes, people paying their debt back to society, but what we also want to see is effective rehabilitation that means they don't do it again and there aren't more victims, and tough community sentences with appropriate curfews, tags, a whole range of other factors, and support to tackle underlying causes of offending is, in my view, a more effective way of doing that. So.
Well, thank you. My first ever Select Committee visit was as a member of this committee in 2006 to HMP Eastwood Park, and one of the key takeaways for our group that day was the message that short custodial sentences for the girls and women in Eastwood Park were pretty pointless, and certainly the educational staff we met at Eastwood Park were very clear with us that they just don't have the amount of time needed to do meaningful work with the prisoners there, and their view was that the vast majority shouldn't even be there. Yeah. Isn't it frustrating that 18, 19 years on, or whatever it is, we're kind of still stuck having the same policy discussion about this?
In one sense, but I possibly view this with a little more optimism than you do, Chair, although I haven't been in this place as long as you have, so maybe that sort of early days, even after 9 years, optimism and positivity might still just be lingering on. But the point I make there is we did see, and we did put into the female offenders strategy and then the delivery plan, which came a few years later, slightly delayed by COVID, how we can continue that drive. And we are seeing fewer women in prison, and so we are making progress, I think, on that. There's more to do, and if I take as a model what we've done with youth justice, it's very different because they're children, but I think we are now 70% fewer children and young people in custody than there were in 2010, and those that are very challenging because basically they have done something very violent or very dangerous, and therefore they've got custody, and it's right that that option is available for them. But with a lot of others, we'll try and divert, we'll try and find alternative punishments, and shortly we'll be seeing the first people going into our new secure school down in Kent, which is another route. It's a slight rabbit hole away from Wales, but hopefully it illustrates the point and the direction.
Thank you very much. Tonya, please.
Yeah, going to your relationship with Welsh Government, how would you characterise your relationship with them?
Well, I think, I know that there's been some talk, and I think it was, and this is where I will be corrected by the Chair if I'm wrong, I think it was the Richards Review which talked about the jagged edge in terms of devolution. I have to say, it's in practice, I find the interface between devolved and reserved matters is rarely problematic, particularly at an operational level. Now, there will always be at ministerial level and in the Chair's former role as Secretary of State, there will be occasions where there will be something where there is a disagreement over what is reserved and what is devolved, or often where there are elements of both, how that actually works in practice. But that's more about a policy level when we're doing legislation and so on. At a practical level, I have to say the interface works well. I have worked not just in this department but in a range of departments with a number of ministers in the Welsh Government. I mentioned my recent conversation with Leslie Griffiths just a few weeks ago. I'm always available to her, and she very kindly is always available should I need to speak to her, and I will certainly be taking up her offer to go to Cardiff to see her, A, for a meeting, B, because it's been a little while since I was last enjoying the delights of Cardiff. But at all levels, I think we've got good working relationships, and there are a number of groups that help bring that together in a slightly more formalised way, be it the Interministerial Group for Justice or the Criminal Justice Board for Wales, the informal relationships, and then the relationships that every day Ian will be using with different parts of the public sector and the system in Wales.
Not just Board for Wales you've mentioned, and you've said that these are effective structures. You know, should they be more formally recognised via a memorandum of understanding?
There's two I mentioned there. The Interministerial Group, which my colleague Lord Bellamy sits on, that meets quarterly. I think that we have a system that works. I think that the relationships in practice work, and I don't at the moment see any need for any further formalising of that or sort of putting that within a more detailed framework, and we may come on to it in the context of the Thomas Commission. I don't see a case for further devolution of justice. I suspect Mr Lake at least may challenge me on that point, but I do think it works in practical terms. But as with so many of these things, I spent a long time before I was a member of this House as a councillor and a cabinet member in London. And yes, you can have all the structures in the world, but actually what's far more effective are the working relationships you have with the people in the NHS, with the people in the police. So you can create a framework, as it were, but I think it's actually how it works on the ground and those interpersonal relationships that make it work.
And I appreciate that, but my question would be, does it make it more difficult? And is that what we're seeing in places like Park Prison and in the prison service, that because of these services being devolved, there is a disparity between prisons in England and there are worse issues in Wales. Is that something that you recognise?
I'm not sure I do, if I'm being honest. There will always be occasions where there may be tensions, but there will be if one of Ian's colleagues, who is a prison group director for a part of the UK, of England, I beg your pardon, were here, I suspect they could point to particular local authorities or particular areas where they had a really tricky time and it was scratchy at times. I suspect equally Ian could point to, and he may want to come in a minute, very good examples of that relationship in Wales working in practice. I think actually, if you were a prisoner in a Welsh prison or in an English prison, you would probably not see, and I think your first oral evidence session, someone picked up on this, much difference in terms of what it was like in the prison. Obviously, prison to prison varies, and what you experienced subsequently. Where I think continues to be work to do, and there always has been, because I had responsibility for devolution 2018-19 and female offenders back then when I was in the department, I think there is more we can do to work with on the relationships and the processes for those Welsh people who end up in an English prison, because the challenge then is geography of getting that link up with the services. If you're in Cardiff or Swansea or Berwyn, the services are on your doorstep, they can come to prison, you can do that. It is harder when you're in HMP Durham, for example, or somewhere like that, and I suspect an element of that, reading the evidence, comes through a little bit in respect of female prisoners, that it can be done, and it is being done, but it's just that little bit harder because of the geography. So I would acknowledge that point. But.
So what I'd add to that, I think, is that it's been a bit of a success story, actually. HMPPS in Wales was established as a directorate back in 2014. It was the first time in England and Wales we'd brought together management of probation and prisons, and it was deliberately done to sort of ensure that working within the Devolved Administration was as smooth as it could be. And I think it's worked incredibly well. I think that as well as the sort of the day-to-day really positive engagement that the Minister's referred to, there are really good examples of us co-commissioning services together. We've got good examples of forward-looking, so we understand what policy developments are coming, and working with what's called a Justice in Wales Strategy Group. It's an official group that sort of ensures that engagement and that working is as smooth as it can be. But I would genuinely categorise it as a very positive relationship.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Beth, with the supplementary.
I mean, all the evidence that I've been presented with up until now has shown that there is a crisis in the prison system, and what's happened in Park is a symptom of the crisis that is taking place. So I'm a bit taken aback by some of the comments that things are going well. And in terms of devolution, I mean, Welsh Government commissioned the Constitutional Commission, and they recommended justice is devolved. So, you know, all of the signs from Wales are that is what Wales wants and needs. And the academics from Cardiff University who give evidence to this committee referred to the current relationship and situation as a jagged edge, because you've got competing demands, different electoral mandates, different political priorities. You've said yourself that health, housing, education is devolved. Inevitably, there are going to be tensions. So why are you so opposed to justice being devolved, Minister?
Well, there's 2 points. I was very glad you directed that at me rather than a civil servant who would have cited it as a political question. I mean, in terms of the jagged edge, I think it was cited in your first evidence session by some academics, potentially, I think, quoting the Richards Commission as the original source. But I'm familiar with the phrase. I mean, I suppose the question is, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is essentially, has the department's position changed since 2019, since the Thomas Commission and so on, and if not, why not? I don't like to preempt the question, but I think that's what essentially you're asking. And no, the short answer is our position on the Thomas Commission's recommendations hasn't changed since 2019. Our view is that the most effective way of administering justice is through a single jurisdiction, and that includes the courts, the professional legal services community, and therefore flowing from that, the prisons system. We think that the England and Wales justice system is a very good justice system. We think it works well. Across the piece, I include courts, I include the legal profession, I include the whole bit in that sense. And I think there are benefits for Wales in that context, as well as economies of scale, of course. And it's also important to reflect on the fact that the legal profession is trained because it's single jurisdiction. They can practice in Wales, they can practice in England. That means there's a much greater pool of legal expertise who will happily travel to Cardiff to attend court sessions, etc. So there's an availability of professional legal advice that I think might potentially be more limited if you started having different jurisdictions and barristers, lawyers, etc. being forced to choose. The other points I would make are firstly, devolving justice would effectively mean duplicating justice functions in Wales. There are no prisons in Wales that can hold Category A prisoners, for example. By operating on an England and Wales basis, you get greater flexibility within the system in managing prison populations, in particular prisoners. And I don't think that devolution of more justice or all justice functions to Wales would actually remove the so-called jagged edge. I think it would just simply risk shifting the devolution boundary, so there would potentially be a larger and even more complex jagged edge or interface between a devolved justice system, reserved laws, and I don't see, if I'm being honest, I don't see the benefit for the people of Wales in revisiting that devolution settlement in that way. I appreciate the Honourable Lady may take a different view.
Are you familiar with the...
Sorry, Beth, we're going to have to move on. Sorry, time is against us. Yes. Ben Lake.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. You anticipated...
In a timely fashion.
You might be surprised. You anticipated my question in an earlier response, and it's actually to do with the placing of prisoners in prisons perhaps far... some distance away from their resettlement communities and their families, and I appreciate that it is policy to try and house prisoners as close as possible to their resettlement communities, but of course it's not always possible, and I think you mentioned that there are still there will be prisoners from Wales who are in prisons in England, and I'm just interested to learn a bit more about how the department, or what steps could be taken to improve the way in which we deal with those prisoners that are housed in England in terms of their resettlement, and making sure that those relationships are in place in an effective manner prior to the release, because it's something that previous witnesses to the inquiry have raised as a potential problem area.
And I think that's a fair question. I mean, though we aim or seek to try to keep prisoners from Wales in prisons in Wales, as I set out, there are occasions where that can't happen, where a woman is sentenced to a custodial term. It will have to be in a prison in England, and I recognise that the Welsh Government is very clear that while that presents challenges, they don't want a female prison in Wales, and that is a point I accept. Similarly, Category A prisoners. So there will always be an element of that. Take, for example, a Welsh male prisoner during their resettlement phase. We'll always try to find a way to ensure they're released from prison in Wales, so transfer them back, so there is at least that point. It won't work in every case, but we will always try to do that. We've also developed an offender management-led resettlement service delivered by probation staff, which is deployed in prisons in Wales and community offices to provide that service. It does allow earlier engagement in the resettlement conversations to ensure better integration in the community, and I'm put on record my gratitude for the joint working that happens across a whole range of Welsh public bodies in that respect. For those in English prisons, their community offender managers, we try to get them to engage at the earliest possible stage, so prisoners understand at least the journey and the challenges, and it gives more time for those conversations with devolved services. There are challenges which I do recognise, which is not so much on release, although we may touch on that again later, but also when prisoners are placed long distances away from family, maintaining those family relationships is hard and expensive. So we do try to support that through a prison visit scheme where hardship funding is available, with more video links where we can, those sort of things, because it does make a real difference. And another factor, which is not so much pertaining to release, but is something that actually even recently I've been looking at again, is there more we can do in English prisons, particularly in the female estate, where there isn't a choice, in a sense, about Welsh language resources as well, and those sort of factors, which do matter. Maybe to a small number of prisoners, but it matters, and whether there's a bit more we can do around that.
Thank you. And if I can move on to a slightly different aspect of rehabilitation, and something the committee's received quite a bit of evidence is just the important role and contribution that voluntary organisations make in terms of helping to rehabilitate offenders. My first question in that regard is, do you think we are cognizant of just how dependent we are on voluntary organisations for many rehabilitation schemes?
I think we are. I mean, I had the privilege of actually, when I was in a previous portfolio as Victims Minister, spending a lot of time working with third sector and voluntary organisations in terms of support services for victims of crime. But they play an equally important role in supporting those who have perpetrated crimes, often who are victims as well. So particularly in the female estate, there's a crossover. And I was recently on a visit to the Nelson Trust in Gloucester and at Eastwood Park. So I went with the Bishop to see them and their work. So I pay huge tribute to them, but also to the whole range of organisations. And I know that we do provide support and funding, but I also recognise from when I did the victim strategy that even though we've increased funding for victim support services and those charities, a whole range of things, I know a lot of them, when they came to me, would say, that's great, but it's still tight. B, I recognise there is a very difficult balance to strike often between, going back to our previous conversation, security and vetting, when you're going to the custodial estate to maintain that security, but equally not making it prohibitive for those charities and organisations to actually get in and do the work that they do. And another challenge I know, which they often raise, is multi-year funding. It's great to get a grant for a project. They'll employ people, they'll do it, but the challenge is then, how do I keep them once that's up and running? With victim support services, we looked at doing that. We have put in place multi-year funding, although obviously, as you'll all be familiar with, subject to spending review cut-off points when you go through a new spending review. I'm currently looking at, and I spoke in the context of preparing for this committee about, is there more we can do in the context of the custodial estate to support those services? Because a whole range of services, the Shannon Trust, Duke of Edinburgh's, I should put on the record my sister is a director of that, just for the declaration of interest, as I mention it. The Nelson Trust, a whole range, and each and every one of us will know groups from our constituencies who do that. They do an amazing job, but I am conscious, I think going to your question, they do find it challenging at times in terms of the funding context, but also in terms of that forward view. I can't magic up a vast amount of money, but I do recognise the value they bring, and I'll continue to look at that.
And just in terms of, thank you, Minister, and just in terms of perhaps individual rehabilitation schemes in specific prisons, would it be the Criminal Justice Board for Wales that would perhaps have that oversight to identify, for example, we're familiar with the Clink, for example, in Cardiff and Swansea and the work that they do, but of course, at present, they're looking at 2025, and unless new funding and grants are being sort of confirmed, that might come to an end in 2025. So which body or organisation would be sort of keeping an eye on the various schemes, how long they have left in terms of their funding, to possibly anticipate any problem issues so that we don't lose, the invaluable contribution they make to the rehabilitation of offenders.
So Clink sit as a member of the Criminal Justice Board in Wales, and we work very closely with them. So it's not only HMPPS in Wales that looks at contracting and sort of the arrangements that are in place. We've got a range of commissioned rehabilitation services. Another factor that people have criticised for us in the past, I think, is that we also look at the lots are too big when we advertise those. So we're very conscious of that, and we're trying to get that as local as we can in terms of going forward. We also work with other agencies, as I said earlier, including the Welsh Government, police and crime commissioners, etc., about jointly commissioning services, and that will be part of a sort of a wider conversation in terms of, what the landscape is looking like in the next couple of years.
That's very promising. Thank you. Changing tack now, finally, for my last question. Justice data. And I was wondering, Minister, whether you might be able to provide an update on the discussions your department's been having with the Welsh Government regarding the publishing of Wales-specific data that's collected by HMPPS. It's not currently routinely published, but it's something that some have argued would be very useful and would help inform the debate on justice policy in Wales.
Yeah, I mean, so we already publish, and I think this came up in various of your evidence sessions, and Liz Saville-Roberts raised it with me as well. We publish a significant volume of data on the justice system that is available as disaggregated data for Wales. Nearly all publications on courts and tribunals have data disaggregated. In addition, for prisons and probation, all headline data, so prison population, first receptions, releases, prison assaults, probation, employment and accommodation activity, safety and custody, those sort of things, is already available by prison or probation region, including Wales. There are a few challenges. I mean, I start from the premise, and the committee may be aware, I said in a recent debate in Westminster Hall that I didn't consider it was an inappropriate or unreasonable request for further exploration of how we could do that, because I forget, and this is, remember, the academic who's done a lot of work on this, who was before your committee, often does this, but he does it by FOIing the data. So we've got the data, and therefore there is a question about, is there a way that we could, without incurring disproportionate cost, do that data crunching and publication ourselves? And that's something I do want to do further work in looking at. But to the specific point, we have had conversations with the Welsh Government, and we have evinced where we can, without creating a huge amount of additional work, where we've got the data and where it wouldn't come at disproportionate cost. We've evinced a willingness to say, are there particular areas, particular data sets that they would wish to see that are not currently disaggregated or published as disaggregated? And I think that those conversations are ongoing, and we await confirmation from them as what specifically they would like to see. When they do, I'm happy to take that away and look at it, obviously viewing it through the prism of value for money and can we afford it? Is the gain limited for the cost, but are there areas where actually the gain would be significant for very marginal cost? So I'm happy to look at it with a relatively open mind when we get that confirmation.
Thank you, Minister.
Great, thank you, Ben. We're shortly drawing to a close. Can I just ask, in follow-up to Ben's question about the role of the charitable sector, the site where there was the Clink restaurant just outside the gate of Cardiff Prison, what's that going to be used for now that the restaurant hasn't had its lease renewed?
The plan for that is it's going to be used as a visitor centre.
For the prison?
Yes.
Visitors, sorry?
Visitor centre. Yeah.
Oh, a visitor centre.
Yes, sorry, yeah.
I thought it was a business centre.
Yeah.
Visitor centre.
No, visitors.
Okay, so it will be used by the prison. And I think a few of us have eaten at that restaurant over the years and had very rewarding, enjoyable experiences. They were very sad to see the closure of that restaurant. What was the factor behind not renewing the lease? Was it because the prison needed that bit of real estate to build some new capacity?
That was a decision actually taken before my time, to be honest. So perhaps that's something we can come back to you on.
Yeah, so if it's helpful, I can add that to my sort of wrap-up letter to you, covering additional bits and pieces that I've volunteered today. But equally, if you believe it would be helpful, I don't want to sort of commit to something I can't do, because there are processes for these things, but I'm sure Ms Sparrow would be happy to have that conversation with them as well. As I say, just with the caveat, unless there is any legal or other reason why you couldn't.
Okay, thank you. So unless there are any further questions from Beth or Ben, just remains to say thank you to you both.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. and Mr. Barrow, thank you very much for giving us your time and being so frank and open with us in your answers. I appreciate
Always dangerous in this business, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Ended. The proceeding has 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 ended.